I can take a guess. With the, the whole critical race theory conversation happening right now, I think the hesitation for a lot of educators may be whether to have these discussions or not. But as far as SEL and students' behavioral like plans are in place, I think, like I said, because SEO is something that we do on a daily basis, I think just highlighting it a little more by taking it a step further would increase results tremendously. But that's all I can say about that because I am not sure. So hopefully that answers part of your question.
I think you answered that very well.
Thank you. Well, if there aren't any questions, I will pass it to my fellow McNair scholar, Natalie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Stetler. My major is political science, and my research interest is forced migration. The United Nations Human Rights Council defines forced migration as someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Forced migrants include refugees and internally displaced persons. Refugees are people who have been displaced and have crossed an international border, while internally displaced persons are those that are displaced but are still inside their home country. Now you might be thinking to yourself, wow, that's awful, but why should this matter to me? Over the last 10 years, the number of forced migrants has more than doubled from 40 million to over 80 million. Most of these refugees are still awaiting resettlement in camps because only less than 1% of them have been resettled into a third country. This is largely because most developed countries, including the United States, are either unprepared or unwilling to resettle refugees. Among other reasons, this can partly be attributed to a lack of political will. Once resettled into a third country, such as the United States, refugees face major challenges integrating into a new society. However, there is a massive gap in literature when it comes to understanding integration of South Asian refugees in the United States, and this is the focus of my research. The concept of refugee resettlement and integration has been the subject of extensive research and debate in recent years. However, little is known about what factors specifically contribute to successful integration. The goal of this research is to identify factors that affect the integration of resettled refugees into their new societies. Specifically, what explains why some South Asian refugees are successfully integrating into American society while others are not. Using the case of newly resettled Bhutanese refugees, my research analyzes the impact of demographic, socioeconomic, and political factors on the integration of refugees in Michigan. The first Nepali settlers in Bhutan appeared in early British colonial accounts in 1903. From there, a large community of Bhutanese Nepali quickly formed in southern Bhutan. In the early 20th century, and even today, most of the people in Bhutan are Buddhist and speak a Tibeto-Burman language. However, the Bhutanese Nepali maintained key aspects of their Nepali culture as they integrated into Bhutan. The most common language spoken among the Bhutanese Nepalis is Nepali, and the most common religion is Hindu. As a part of their Hindu faith, many Bhutanese Nepali believe in the caste system, which designates a strict social hierarchy based on supposed spiritual purity. Discriminatory practices against the Bhutanese Nepali began in the 1960s. Bhutanese Nepali were required to give both cash and labor instead of just labor like most of the citizens in the country. When Bhutan passed the Citizenship Act of 1977, intermarriage between Bhutanese Nepali and native Bhutanese was discouraged, and the citizenship requirements for Bhutan became more stringent. When Bhutan passed the Marriage Act of 1980, intermarriage between the Bhutanese Nepali and native Bhutanese became illegal. In 1988, the annual census in Bhutan began sorting Bhutanese Nepali into different categories and classifying some as non-nationals. This evolved into a method for the government of Bhutan to monitor and evict the Bhutanese Nepali population. Soon after the implementation of the census practices, the Driglomnamzu was established, which required the observation of a strict code regarding etiquette, belief, and the removal of Nepali teachings from schools, which caused widespread unhappiness for Bhutanese Nepalis. These laws essentially forbid Bhutanese Nepalis from practicing their Hindu beliefs in any way, including the caste system. Over time, Bhutan's discriminatory policies would lead to torture, false imprisonment, and even death for thousands of Bhutanese Nepali people. There has been extensive prior research into the concept of integration. As a result, the term integration has been assigned multiple definitions by different scholars. For example, Agar and Strang proposed 10 key interdependent domains as a conceptual integration framework: employment, health, housing, education, social bridges, social bonds, social links, language, cultural knowledge, safety, stability, rights, and finally, citizenship. Unlike most definitions of integration, this framework emphasizes the importance of enabling refugees to maintain their ethnic identity throughout this integration process. In 2015, the panel on the integration of immigrants into American society defined integration as a two-way process in which immigrants and their host societies come to resemble one another. In the same year, Rodriguez Garcia argued that integration is a contextual phenomenon generally viewed as a positive alternative to assimilation. Assimilation is a one-way process that requires newcomers to fully adopt their new country's culture and practices, while integration is a two-way process in which newcomers and natives adopt each other's cultures. Rodriguez Garcia argues that integration in contemporary times will become increasingly difficult to measure due to the rise of diverse and multicultural communities. This makes it hard for researchers to identify who integrates whom into what. As a result, research on integration must come from an integral perspective to best assess collaboration between natives and newcomers. 80,000 Bhutanese fled to Nepal. 80,000 Bhutanese were forced to leave Nepal in the early 1990s. By 2007, Nepal's refugee camps had a population of more than 100,000 displaced Bhutanese Nepalis. Between 2008 and 2016, 85,000 Bhutanese Nepali refugees were resettled across the United States. Around 2,100 Bhutanese Nepali refugees have been resettled across the state of Michigan. And since then, the Bhutanese Nepali population of Michigan has grown to over 17,000, mostly residing in Grand Rapids or Lansing. Resettled individuals' willingness to allow their children to marry someone outside of their ethnic group or an American is a true measure of integration into American society. While this may not be the most accurate measure of integration, we argue that refugees who support intermarriage with Americans are willing to accept American culture and feel that they belong to American society. Intermarriage across ethnic groups is a characteristic of American culture, but forbidden in many South Asian cultures, including the Bhutanese Nepali. Intermarriage across caste and/or ethnic groups in Nepal, where many of the Bhutanese refugees originated, is discouraged. This is unlike the United States, where intermarriage across ethnic, religious, cultural, and class lines is not only legal, but commonplace. Those who have truly integrated into American culture must support intermarriage between ethnic groups, as it is a core aspect of modern American society. While not all resettled refugees might be willing to support intermarriage, those who came with a higher level of education or who sought an educational degree after being resettled into the United States are more likely to support intermarriage. And this leads to my first hypothesis. Based on my theory, I have developed some hypotheses. While not all resettled refugees, those who came with a higher level of education or who sought an educational degree after being resettled into the United States are more likely to support intermarriage. And this leads to my first hypothesis: respondents with higher education are more likely to support intermarriage. Additionally, younger generation refugees are more likely to support intermarriage than older generation refugees than after being resettled into the United States. Older generations are typically more traditional and have stronger cultural ties to their native culture and to their native country. This leads to my second hypothesis. Respondents of higher age are less likely to support intermarriage. Also, individuals who have a higher income status or wealth are more likely to support intermarriage. Those with higher incomes tend to have more external contacts outside of their ethnic community. This leads to my third hypothesis. Respondents with higher income are more likely to support intermarriage. Resettled individuals who participated in the last presidential election are more likely to support intermarriage as they are fulfilling a civic duty to the United States who supports intermarriage. This leads to my fourth hypothesis. Respondents who voted in the last presidential election are more likely to support intermarriage. Individuals who frequently interact with individuals from outside of their own community and culture are more likely to support intermarriage as they have a more developed awareness and support of other ethnic groups. Respondents with frequent outside interactions are more likely to support intermarriage. Individuals who have arrived earlier and have spent longer periods of time in the United States are likely to have been more exposed to American culture. Therefore, they are more familiar with the practices and more likely to support intermarriage. Therefore, my sixth hypothesis, respondents with more time spent in the United States are more likely to support intermarriage. Data from my research comes from a survey conducted by my mentor, Dr. Prakash Adhikari, and his colleagues. The sample for this survey is 102 newly resettled former Bhutanese refugees currently living in the state of Michigan. The survey utilized both snowball and respondent-driven sampling. Snowball sampling relies on the referrals from initially known subjects to additional subjects. For this survey, the number of referrals was limited to reduce sample bias. Respondent-driven sampling was used to protect the identities of those who wish to remain anonymous due to stigmatization, as well as address the issues of inference and generalizability caused by snowball sampling. Dr. Adhikari and his team identified potential survey respondents using ties to the Bhutanese community of Michigan, a nonprofit dedicated to assisting former refugees living in the state of Michigan, as well as two VOLOGs, Bethany Christian Services, located in Grand Rapids, and St. Vincent Catholic Charities, located in Lansing. VOLOG stands for Volunteer Refugee Resettlement Agencies, who work to resettle refugees successfully across the United States. The first stage of survey administration began in January 2020. Trained enumerators conducted in-person surveys using paper and pencil. However, Dr. Adhikari was forced to stop interviews in March of 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown. The second stage of survey administration began in summer 2021. The survey was made available online using Qualtrics. Unfortunately, Dr. Adhikari and his research colleagues quickly discovered that a large percentage of the respondents were illiterate. To overcome this challenge, enumerators were trained to conduct the online survey in person. So the data in my paper mainly comes from the second phase of the survey conducted in fall of 21 and spring of 22. The dependent variable integration in my research is a dichotomous measure of whether or not resettled refugees were willing to allow their children to marry someone of an American nationality. Respondents were asked, would you allow your child to marry an American? A positive response is coded as 1, negative is 0. My independent variables are age, net monthly income in US dollars, whether or not respondents voted in the last presidential election, social network, and number of years since resettlement in the United States. Dr. Adhikari and I have already identified many fascinating patterns in our preliminary results, but if you want to hear about those, you're going to have to come back in the fall. Findings from my research are expected to better inform the public as well as policymakers about why some resettled refugees integrate while others do not. It is my hope that my findings will encourage policymakers to make improvements to local, state, and federal integration processes in the United States for the over 80 million refugees still waiting in camps. Thank you to Dr. Adhikari and the Bhutanese communities of Michigan for making this project possible. And I would be happy to take any questions at this time.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay. How did you decide to or come across choosing the Bhutanese population as the ones you wanted to look at?
Well, I was working with Dr. Adhikari on forced migration research, and he is of Nepali origin, and so he's familiar with the Bhutanese Nepali situation, and that he introduced me to it, and ever since then I've become very interested and intrigued by the situation, and I want to get involved in the research.
How long did the Bhutanese Nepali refugees await resettlement to the United States?
Many of them waited 10, 15, 20 years in refugee camps in Nepal before they were resettled to the United States.
I have a question. I think you did mention you briefly talked about it in the beginning, but I think you said it was something about like 80,000 people left Bhutan or something like that. What exactly is causing the people to move so like such a large amount of people to, to exit a country at once? Because that's a ton of people,
Yeah, well, I should have phrased that better. They weren't exactly choosing to leave. Ethnic cleansing was occurring. So there was genocide, false imprisonment, torture, murder, like mass killings, and many millions, not millions, sorry, tens of thousands of Bhutanese Nepali were put on trains and sent to Nepal by the Bhutanese government. They had no choice whether or not they were going to leave Bhutan. And so some of them left voluntarily, I'm trying to flee death, trying to survive, and others were forced to leave altogether. And if that's all, thank you guys for coming to our symposium.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Excellent job, scholars. Big round of applause. I'm sure everyone is feeling much more relaxed now that we made it through. So very good job. Thank you to all of our wonderful mentors. We really appreciate your time and energy. I know the scholars do as well, as evidenced by all of them mentioning how much they appreciate all of you. Big shout out to Dr. Brooke Harrison, of course, for helping orchestrate this whole endeavor and being such a big support to our scholars this spring. And also